Let's talk a little bit about data classification. And for that, I'm using a house price data set for London, and there's 983 small areas. I turned on the layer styling panel, and I've styled it using an equal interval classification and 10 classes. Now, if I wanted to produce a map which made it look like house prices are only high in a couple of areas in London, I could do something like this. But really, relative to the rest of the UK, house prices in London are very high. And there's also some areas in London that are much higher than others, but this variation doesn't really come through in this map. So what can we do? Well, if I chose equal count and 5 classes, which would usually be the default, we do see a lot more variation. If I expand the categories, you'll see that I've right-clicked and I'm showing the feature count. And equal count puts roughly the same number of areas in each category. Whereas equal interval, the same numeric interval is applied to each category. And in this case, it doesn't really make much sense from an analytical point of view. So equal count, yes, that's probably more useful for understanding variation. We can also use other things like natural breaks. In this case, something like house prices, which are usually understood in round numbers, natural breaks might be okay, but it's not as intuitive. We could also use pretty breaks, which sort of chunks it up into round bands of 500,000 in this case. We could change the numbers up and down. And we also have things like standard deviation, logarithmic, and fixed interval. So the key thing is, when you're mapping things like house prices and other data that varies across geographic space, and you choose a graduated classification to create a choropleth map, you need to think a bit about how you're going to classify it. With house prices, I would usually do it manually to some extent, and you can always do that by double-clicking any number in the values column and entering your numbers manually, which is often pretty useful. So in this case, equal count gives a reasonable representation of the spatial variation of house prices in London, whereas something like equal interval doesn't, because it masks a lot of variation within particularly the first category. So have a think about this kind of thing when you're mapping data across geographic space, and don't just accept the default without thinking about it.